Hello, welcome to the I Am Barabbas podcast. We are continuing on in our study of the Torah, and we've actually reached the end of the book of Genesis. So Genesis chapter 47 through the end of chapter 50. 1 Kings chapter 2 verses 1 through 12 is our portion from the prophets, and then 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 1 through 9 is our portion this week from the New Testament. So you can see that the title of this week's reading is "And He Lived," and what these passages are all concerning, what the theme is around all of them, at least from my perspective, is what it's like to reach the end of a life and then to kind of have final wishes for your children, and then to see like how in those final wishes you can read into what the person's intentions were about the way they lived and what they want to be remembered as, and so on and so forth. And then so that's what the focus is in the Genesis passage and the First Kings passage. We're going to look at the end of Jacob's life. We're going to look at the end of Joseph's life. We're going to see how each of them charged their children or their brothers in the case of Joseph, as far as like what they want to do, what was important for them. Then we're going to see the end of David's life and see how he charged Solomon, what he wanted Solomon to do at the end of his life. And it's all about legacy, and what are we living for as we live here on earth. And then that's what Peter is teaching about in that passage there from the New Testament, and the perspective that we as New Testament believers, after finding Yeshua, after finding salvation through his death and resurrection, how we view life, and what we should want as far as legacy and in terms of just living here on earth, and what are we looking for, and what our hope is in. So let's start with the opening part of our passage. So again, we have three characters, three end of lives given. It's Jacob, Joseph, and David. We're starting with Jacob. What's really a neat observation here by David Kimhi, which was cited in Robert Alter's translation of the Bible. He made note of the kind of the parallel here with the first 17 years Joseph lived in Jacob's lap, and the final 17 years Jacob lives in Joseph's lap. So it's kind of, if I said that right, Joseph lives in Jacob's lap as the first 17 years, just meaning that he's under his care. And then now the final 17 years of Jacob's life, he's in Joseph's care. So just like this parallel kind of book ending for Jacob, living with the son that he very obviously loves more than any of his other sons. We've discussed all of that, and why that's there is because of Rachel, but it comes up again in these passages and the blessings that are given to Joseph and his two grandsons. So that's where we start. So this passage again in verse 28 talks about the parallel of the 17 years. Then you have the total number of years of Jacob's life, which is 147. You remember our what or not our the scriptures and the rabbinical view and the Judaic view of Genesis, and just the lifespan of the forefathers was that they would, if they reached 120 or more, that was a good sign for them, that they had lived a good life and that God had blessed them with many years. And that number comes from the book, from Genesis chapter 6, where God is talking about the numbering the years of man to 120. And so that's where that interpretation of the years comes from, just in case you're wondering. So, why they're telling us this is 147 is significant because it's more than 120. So it points to God approving of Jacob's life and giving him a long life. That's the one understanding of that. Anyway, so in verse 29 and 30, you see that Jacob is feeling he's going to die, and he asks Joseph to put his hand under his thigh, because he wants to make a covenant, or he wants to make Joseph make him a promise about what he's going to do with his body after he dies. And if you remember, if you've been studying for along with us, hopefully in your mind this kind of clicked. The connection was made way back in Genesis chapter 24 when Abraham was about to die. He also charged a servant Eliezer to go find a bride for Isaac. Remember that story? So in Genesis chapter 24, and he also had Eliezer put his hand under his thigh. I'm not, it's just a thing that was done to like do a show a promise, make a covenant. It's like, when I was growing up, we would do pinky promises. Like we would tie pinkies together. Uh, there, people would then be like, oh, we're gonna make a spit promise, whatever. Where you'd spit in each hand and you'd shake and smash them together and shake whatever. Just over time, like cultures will come up with ways to seal pacts, right? To make a covenant with each other. And it just seemed like with this family, they had this thing of putting the thigh under the hand of the person you're making the promise to. So he's like, Joseph, put your hand under my thigh. And he makes him promise him that when he dies, that he's going to take his bones and his body and his bones out of Egypt and bury him back in the promised land. Jacob does not want to spend eternity or spend the life after his death, his body. He doesn't want his body to spend time outside of Canaan any longer. And we've looked at this theme with Jacob throughout his lifespan, how he understood the importance of the inheritance and the blessing, and that's why he did what he did to get in front of Esau and to take the blessing and to take the birthright, because for him it was something he valued and something he wanted. He was not really trusting God in the way that he did all that stuff. And certainly we look back on that and how God shows us through scripture and through the prophecies that he didn't approve of Jacob's methods. But ultimately it's God who is going to keep his covenant, and it's God who's going to choose who is going to carry on that covenant. And so he had chosen Jacob despite all of his failures. And so Jacob, left Canaan, running away from his brother. He gets married, he gets back, he hesitates to enter the land, worried about his brother. We discussed all of that stuff. And now, before he came into Egypt, we looked at, I think it was just last week, how he was unsure, like, should I be leaving the promised land again? He doesn't want to go. For him, this is the most important thing, is to be in this land that was promised to his father and to his father's father. And so he's making Joseph promise him that when he dies, he takes him back home to the cave that Abraham bought to bury Sarah in, and to bury him there. And so Joseph makes that promise and makes that covenant. And it's kind of interesting. There's like three stories told in these chapters. There's this story here. Then we have the blessing of Ephraim and Manasseh, which it kind of feels like, all these things happening together, because each of them surround the same time where Jacob feels like he's going to die. So I'm not sure. To me, it seems like it's a separate period. Like he feels like he's about to die. He calls his son over, swear to me that you won't leave me here. Okay, Dad, I will. They make the swear. It says he bows his head down in worship on the head of his staff. So it's just like, okay, so he's praying to God. Thank you, God. Please make this happen. Then in chapter 48, it says after these things, so I guess some time passes, don't know how much time. He asks Joseph, or someone tells Joseph, your dad looks sick. And so he goes and he takes with him Manasseh and Ephraim. Remember, those are Joseph's two sons. Manasseh was born first. Manasseh's name is related to the idea that he's released, the feelings of anger or whatever, the debt that his brothers owe him. He's released that. He's thanked God for, his son. And Ephraim is just the name indicating the bounty that God has given him. And so he's moved on. He brings these sons to Jacob, and Jacob says to him that, he kind of recounts his own history. He says, El Shaddai appeared to me in Luz. If you remember, Luz was the original name of Bethel before, it was changed to Bethel. So he just kind of uses the name interchangeably, or just over time, like people edited it back to say Bethel, Luz, however it was. We looked at it before. But Jacob, that's why he says Luz, because that was its original name before it was changed to Bethel. And he said, so he recalls how God called him there, and he saw God standing at the top of that ziggurat type structure, and tells him he's going to bless him and everything. And so he's recounting that. So he says, now I want your two sons who were born in the land of Egypt, I want you to know that they're mine. And just like a really interesting passage here, because as I was studying, I was like, wow, so what Jacob is doing is he's essentially taking Joseph's two oldest sons, who have been, they're born already. He doesn't know. We don't know if he's had other sons yet. The idea is that these are the first two, and Jacob is saying in this passage here, I want these two to be considered as my own. in terms of inheritance and what it means for them in the future and what their names mean and the significance of those things. So that's what he says in verse 5. Your two sons were born in the land of Egypt. Before I came to you in Egypt, they are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, just like Reuben and Simeon. So he's saying, I'm going, just like my two oldest sons, I'm going to have them up there as well. They're going to be like my two oldest sons. And what Jacob does here with the blessings for then Ephraim and Manasseh, and then what he does later, we see for Reuben and Simeon, it all comes together for us to understand that what essentially he's doing is he's saying, my first two born sons, they're kind of going to be lost. Like they're not getting the inheritance of being, multiplied. To go back to what he was saying, why he was saying, because I'm going to make you fruitful and multiply you and turn you into assembly of peoples. I will give you this land to your seed as an everlasting possession. What he's saying is that part of the covenant, that's not going to Reuben and Simeon. That's going to go to Ephraim and Manasseh. And we're going to actually see that play out. I'm going to show some maps and we'll talk about some of the history, but that's exactly what ends up playing out in terms of Reuben and Simeon in terms of their presence in Israel's history. They fade away. And it's Ephraim and Manasseh who become kind of larger parts of the nation and even get significant parts of the land of the promised land. And so that's what he's doing here. And the reason why is at first I thought it was simply because of what Reuben and Simeon did, and we'll get to that in a second. We've talked about that before. But it seems that within the context of the passage, I don't want to run away from the context of the passage. It seems that the reason why he's doing this is because it's because of his relationship with Rachel. In verse 7, it says, Now as for me, when I came from Padan, to my sorrow, Rachel died along the way in the land of Canaan, while we were still at a distance from entering Ephrath, and that's considered Bethlehem, and I buried her there. And that verse there, Robert Alter makes mention of it. Like it seems kind of out of place, because right before that, he says, that Ephraim and Manasseh will be his, just like Reuben and Simeon. Any descendant of yours or your father, whom you father, will then be yours. So he's saying, your first two are mine, the rest will be yours, and they will be identified by the names of their brothers for their inheritance. So he's making a distinguishing line. Like Ephraim and Manasseh, they will be like my sons. They're going to be inheriting like mine. All the other sons that you have will be yours, and we'll know by their names. And then he says this thing about, he recounts the story about Rachel and about the sorrow of her dying and how he experienced that. And it was Robert Alter who made the point that, some people say that this verse is kind of like signs of editing, and it kind of doesn't make sense, that maybe there were verses in between that were pulled out, or this was it's like a fragment, or just because it doesn't really, they feel like it doesn't fit. But Alter is the one who says that he points out that Rachel's death is something Jacob has never stopped grieving for. It seems like throughout the story of Jacob, since Rachel dies, we saw that he loved her so much that he was willing to work those 7 years. Then he got tricked into the wedding with Leah, and he was willing to marry her still and work another 7 years to have her finally to be free from the debt that he owed for marrying Rachel. And that just showed right there how much he loved her. And it's really all of Leah's issues, and seeing, the relationship with Rachel and how Jacob felt about her. And it's like, oh, he's my husband too, but he doesn't really love me. And it just kind of was the case, right? And the struggles that she had, he cared about her in a way that is unlike any other story, I feel like, in terms of love stories throughout the scripture. And so when she dies, giving birth to Benjamin, it makes sense that he struggles for so long with it, that whole idea. And what essentially he's doing here is, my Rachel only gave me two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. I thought I lost you. Thank God I didn't. You're here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take your first two sons, which are also my two grandsons, also Rachel's two grandsons, and I'm going to make them like mine as well. And what he's kind of doing is like the whole. Remember, Joseph married an Egyptian woman, the daughter of a priest, and so it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to take them away from that inheritance and culture, whatever you would have gotten from that side of the family and from Egypt and everything else. I'm going to take them, bring them over to this side, to my beloved Rachel. I'm going to make her like if they were my son, our sons, me and Rachel's son. So he's essentially adding two sons to Rachel's count by doing that, and that's why that's mentioned there. Is the motivation that why that verse is there? It's the motivation as to why he's doing this. Again, I thought it had to do with Reuben and Simeon and their actions and how they lost their place because of their actually actions that their father did not approve of. While that's going to be true later in the blessings and the blessings and the curses really he gives them, it seems that the reason why he wants these two boys to be like his own is because of that love of Rachel and the fact that these are Rachel's two grandsons. So moving on from that, Joseph then brings his sons and he wants to bless them. And Israel's eyes, it says, has grown heavy with old age, just like Isaac. In that situation, Jacob tricked his father into thinking he was the older son so he could receive the blessing. In this situation, Israel's the one whose eyes have grown heavy, so he can't see. He kisses them, he hugs them, and he's taking the sons and he's going to bless them. And Joseph puts the the older son in front of his right hand, and he puts Manasseh, the older son, in front of his right hand, and Ephraim in front of his left hand. Talking about Israel, because he wants them to bless him. He wants the right hand blessing, the hand that represents power and everything else, and that main blessing looked at earlier to be blessed and multiplied and to have land and everything. He wants that to go to Manasseh because that's his oldest son, and then he wants the left hand blessing to go to Ephraim, the second blessing. But Israel, Jacob, when he stretches out his hands, he crosses them over. So he puts his right hand on Ephraim's head, his left on Manasseh. And you read the passage, what's happening at this moment is it's like kind of like a solemn experience. And so Jacob is there, maybe on his knees, maybe sitting on a chair, maybe on his knees, sitting on the floor. The boys are placed in front of him. Joseph kind of bows down in reverence. So he's not watching this part because he doesn't notice the hands crossed. And then he blesses Joseph. It says, "To God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who shepherded me throughout my life to this day, the angel redeemed me. May he bless the boys and be called by my name and by the name of my fathers, and may they multiply to a multitude in the midst of land." So that's the blessing he's giving to now Ephraim. And he's blessing both of them, but the right hand being on Ephraim is symbolic of who the power, the authority, again, the right hand being a symbol of that, what that is, Jesus being seated at the right hand of the Father. It's a place of prominence. And so when Joseph looks up in verse 17, he saw his dad's hand on the wrong side. He's like, "Oh, Dad, don't do it like that," because he's the firstborn and the father refuses. It makes sense because Jacob, he's the original, secondborn who says, "No, I'm going to be first," right? He's the one that grabbed the heel and came out, and he's the one that manipulated all the situations so that he could be the one to receive the blessing instead of his older brother. And then we saw that happen with Judah's twins, and the same thing happens there as well. And it seems to be just in a pattern that's being established now, where the younger brother becomes greater than the older brother. So it's like countercultural. And that's what he says there in verse 19. "I know, my son, I know. He will also become my people, and he will also become great, but his younger brother will become greater than he is, and his seed with all the fullness of the nations." And then he blessed them and says, "In Israel, in you shall Israel bless by saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." And so he put Ephraim and Manasseh before Manasseh. If you notice, even in the writing of the story, Ephraim's name keeps coming up before Manasseh. And it's foreshadowing to this moment where Jacob's going to do this thing. He says, he closes this chapter saying, "Now I give myself you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and my bow." So what he's saying there is that he's going to give him an extra, without a doubt, I'm going to give you what I took from the Amorites. And we'll look at the land there and see, but it's just saying the land that I won, the land that I gained, through my own work, I'm going to be giving that to your son. So it's like a special piece of land because it's actually something that they already own, right? You look at the lands that they have now, it's the land that Abraham bought, and and then there's the lands that Jacob owns, and part of that land is the land that Simeon and Levi took with Shechem and the whole slaughtering of all that, which Jacob wasn't particularly happy about, but what he's saying is what I've gotten so far, I'm giving to them. So they already have something established. Remember, the rest of the land technically belongs to the Canaanites, and so the rest of the tribes and everything else, they're going to have to go out and earn it themselves. So verse 49 is when he then gathers. So like the scene kind of changes again. Now he's gathering all his sons towards him, and he's giving blessings. And they're supposed to be blessings, but they come out like curses for some of them, especially with Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. So at the beginning here in verse 3 says, Reuben, my firstborn of you, my vigor, the firstborn of my power, endowed with extra dignity, endowed with extra strength. So he's talking about, he says, my firstborn, my vigor, and the firstborn of my power. So he's like if you think of fertility as a father, and how strong your fertility can be, and the ability to, and we know that he ends up having 12 sons. So he's a very fertile and virile man, right? So what he's saying here is that Reuben, you're the firstborn, you're the first produce of this very fertile and virile human man. Like that's it. So you have extra strength, extra dignity. They're the first fruits of this very well producing tree, is what he's saying there. But like water boiling over, you will not have extra. So water boiling over, and water boiling over is out of control, and you lose something, right? When you have water boiling over, you lose. If it's just water, you're losing water. If you're boiling rice, this has happened to me a few times, where you set the rice to boil and you don't want to be patient enough to keep it at that right low temperature so it can just get to boil and then cook the rice. You say, well, I'm going to start high, and then when it gets boiling, I'll turn it low. Big mistake, because typically it just gets too hot, the water boils over, you lose water, which you need the certain amount of water to get the rice done the right way, and then you just also make a huge mess with all the stuff you didn't get rinsed off with the rice coming out of the pot. It's out of control. It's a problem, and that's the analogy given here in verse 4. Like water boiling over, you will not have extra. You're going to lose something. Why? For you got up into your father's bed when you defiled a maid's couch. And I've been talking about this before, and this was referenced back to Genesis chapter 35, verse 22, when he tried to have his father's concubine. And definitely, like in the story of Reuben, you continually see him trying to get back into that position of being the firstborn and being respected by everybody and listened to. But it's very obvious that he's lost all that. And now it's made clear. And we did look at it back when we looked at Genesis chapter 35. So if you've been watching, you're familiar with this portion. And that's it. That's all he has for Reuben. And what's really interesting is that this tribe typically is understood to be like kind of gone, disappears before the monarchy begins. And we'll look at their allotment of lands later and figure out why that happens. But it definitely is the case for Reuben, and the tribe of Reuben is kind of like, where'd they go? Then he talks about Simeon and Levi. Remember from the very beginning, he says, the instruments of violence are their knives. In their secret counsel may their soul not enter. And so what he's saying is he denounces their wisdom. Their wisdom is with violence. And he also feels like the two of them took pleasure in what they did. In later on, it says, for in their anger they slew men, and in their self-will they maimed men. So Robert Alter's version, it was Robert Alter's version, talked about they had no remorse as well. And what he's saying is that by not having remorse and maybe even enjoying what they did, there is an issue there with these two. And that's why, because remember, what they did was they saw their sister was raped by the men of this city, or like the Shechem, the ruler of a city, or the inheritor of a city. And they saw that all as a plot, and there was a plot to get Jacob to join them and to join their wealth and everything else. And so they went out and they killed everybody there. And what Jacob is saying is, sure, maybe justice needs to be done, justice needs to be enacted for the violence committed against your sister. But what was in their hearts as they did it was kind of like this pleasure and joy, and then a lack of remorse over what they did. And they massacred a town. They killed every male living there that was old enough to be circumcised. So that could have been like anybody from 11 to 12 years old and up. And that's just not a good thing. That's why it's not acceptable to Jacob, because I have heard the arguments before, like why is he mad? He was getting revenge, getting justice for their sister, and sure, again, that, I mean, those who were responsible should be held responsible. And it does say that the entire town of Shechem, like they knew what was going on and they didn't do anything. But in Jacob's eyes, there were also, they just went too far. That's the bottom point, the main point here. And then also he felt like there was a part of them that enjoyed what they did, and then they didn't feel anything bad about it. And so what he says is, I will disperse them in Jacob and I will scatter them in Israel. So with those two things said, what I want to do is switch over from Bible View to one of my maps, and we'll look at the allotments of Israel real quick and see where the tribe of Reuben ended up. That's here on the east side of the Dead Sea, and so that's like present day Jordan, so the Jordan River is kind of like the dividing line. We're talking about east and west, and so the west side you have all the parts of Israel that we're familiar with. The east side is now we know as like Jordan, the country Jordan, and you see that to the east of Gad, the land that goes to Gad are the Ammonites, and they're the ones that were throughout the book of Judges. You read that story, they're constantly a problem. They're constantly having issues. Gad is constantly having issues with them. Reuben's constantly having issues with them. It's because they settled on that side of the Jordan. The whole story is when during the Exodus after they left, they saw that land was good and they wanted to settle there. And so what Moses said, the promise made with, well, I don't remember now, it was Moses or Joshua. The promise that was made was, okay, you can have this land, but promise that you continue to fight with us as we enter into the rest of the land, and then you won't go back and settle in your land until we've all gotten our piece of land. It is, and so they do that, and they keep their promise. But the tribe of Reuben, with that land and the constant attacks from the Ammonites, and then all the nations that come later from those areas, they just end up kind of disappearing by the time we have the story of the beginning of the monarchy. And with Simeon, he says, like, I will disperse you to Israel and to Jacob. Simeon is known to also kind of like disappear in that sense, and you can see where they are. They're south of Judah, and that's where they kind of get absorbed into Judah's tribe. So Judah as a tribe is just kind of like so strong and so powerful and so attractive. We're going to see that in a second, that the tribe from the south, Simeon, just kind of goes into there and they lose themselves. And then with Levi, we know that the tribe of Levi, they become the priests, right? So I've always thought of that as like, oh, the Levites, the Levites are the priestly tribe. I never really caught this fact that they were also seen though as a problem, at least the tribe and their inheritance and stuff, this violence and everything else. And part of Jacob's curse against them was that they were going to be dispersed and scattered. Now, God chooses the Levites to be his own portion, so it's kind of like he redeems them from the acts of their father, but he honors Jacob's curse here about them being dispersed, in that they don't get a land. He tells them, like, your inheritance is going to be me, right? And then they just end up having different cities that belong to them, the Levitical cities, sanctuary cities. And here in this map, they are the green dots. You can see there the cities, Levitical cities, cities of refuge. The green, you have the yellow, or they're kind of like they think about the locations there, so it's just uncertainty. But you see them spread out, the green. Now I have like a red green kind of thing, so it is hard for me to see all of those. But I see the one in Gad. I see the one in Reuben. I don't see any in Judah. I don't know if there are any, but it's because my colors are all blending in there. But if you can look at that, you will see for yourself, and you don't have the same issues I have. You will see for yourself that Levi was indeed scattered and dispersed throughout Israel. And so that's where we go. So we have those are the first three brothers. And I've been teaching before, as we've been going along, that Judah's the one who kind of becomes the de facto firstborn. And so we see here with Judah the kind of blessing from Jacob that you might expect to be given to the firstborn, although that exact blessing was given to Ephraim and Manasseh, as we just looked at. But with Judah, it says, your hand will be on your enemy's neck, your father's sons will bow down to you. He's compared to a lion. So the strength of Judah is what's being is focused on here. And remember, he redeemed himself with his selfless act to sacrifice himself for Benjamin. He's like, I'll be the slave, and that was his moment of redemption. And in doing that, this is why we're seeing him receive these blessings despite all the stuff that led up to this moment. Remember, he was the one that said, put Joseph in the pit and sell him, and he's the one that left his father, went and started a family on his own, and only came back because of the famine, and it seems like that, right? But he does redeem himself with that moment with Benjamin. So he's likened to a lion. It says the throne will stay with him, the scepter will stay with him, and the obedience of all the peoples will remain on. So it's just pointing to the idea of the monarchy is going to come from the tribe of Judah. And for those of us who have been growing up in the church for a while, we know, the phrases like Lion of the tribe of Judah, certainly pointing to the messianic figure that's supposed to come, is supposed to be a branch from David, my servant, the branch. It's repeated in the book of Zechariah. And so a lot of these Bible translations and stuff like that will add some details in there to point to that. And so that's there. If the scepter will not pass between his feet until he comes to it'll belong to who it comes to who it belongs to. So they're pointing to this idea that it's going to keep going until it gets to the one person who's going to always rule, and that all people will be obedient to him. And then he says that binding his full this whole. If you read this and you're like, whoa, what did that mean? What the blessing is, I should say, from Jacob is that Judah is going to be so wealthy that he will tie up his donkey to a vine, and his donkey's called to a choice vine. Why? Because if they eat the grapes, and even the grapes of like the choice wine, if you're into wine, like they say, oh, it's a Napa Valley this, or Willamette Valley that, or this comes from France, or whatever. There are choice vines and choice grapes, and what Jacob is saying is he's gonna have so much wealth that he's just gonna tie up his animals to these things, and it won't matter to him if they eat the grapes, because he's just gonna have so much more to make the wine that he needs. In fact, there's gonna be so much wine, he could even wash his garments in wine and in the blood of grapes in his robes. So it's just like he's gonna have so much wealth, and particularly in the concept of wine, which again is linked to a king and the cup and everything else, and in the color purple. And if you were to wash your robes in purple wine, they'd be stained in purple. So I think that was also part of the imagery there, all tied together. That Judah's going to be wealthy, they're going to be powerful, they're going to be where the monarchy rests. And then in verse 12, his eyes are darker than wine, his teeth are whiter than milk. And that's talking about the beauty of the people as well. They're going to be handsome, good-looking men, a good-looking tribe. That's why I mentioned that earlier about Simeon, and maybe that's where they kind of blended in there, got lost. Then you have Zebulun. It says he who will dwell by the seashore, and that tribe does settle there by the seashore. Issachar is going to be a strong-boned donkey lying down between two saddlebags, and so this points to the fact that they're going to be really good at farming and agriculture, which is true. But they're also going to become slaves to other nations, and that also happens as well. And he leaned on the shoulder to bear a burden and became a forced laborer. So it's like they were really good, strong when it came to digging in the dirt and agriculture and farming, Issachar. But then, other nations come in, and we know the story of Babylon and Assyria and everybody, and then just all the other fighting in Judges. There's so many times in Judges where a group will come in like the Ammonites and then just take over, and then they cry out and need redemption. So there's just this cycle that happens, and so during that period, Issachar definitely gets used as forced labor. It says Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel, and then let Dan be a serpent beside the road. So Dan actually ends up settling the north. And what we can do is we can just go back to the map, because I do have my notes here. So with Dan, well, we can go back a little bit. So Judah, pretty familiar. Most people are familiar with Judah. It's pretty much the region now that's like the focus of the nation of Israel, right? You have Bethlehem just to the north, and you have you have Benjamin's allotment, and Jerusalem's kind of in that allotment. And there's Dan. Dan is settled up here. They end up getting attacked a lot by outsiders. So this region here just shows Judah, but this Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, this whole western side that I'm kind of highlighting with my mouse, which I'm realizing may or may not be seen. Let me roll this up. So yeah, so now I can see this. So it's this area here. All of this area here was Philistine country, and so with Dan being to the north of that, they would constantly be getting attacked. There's stories there about David and just all that was happening, and so they had to adapt to guerrilla warfare. And so just going back to that prophecy regarding them, it says that Dan will judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel, and that's true. I think Samson was one of the judges that came from Dan, and he judges Israel. But then he also becomes a serpent beside the road, a viper by the path, and it speaks to the whole guerrilla warfare type thing that they had to become well versed in. They're always in trouble, and so they would be, sneaky guerrilla warfare, hiding in bushes and popping out and that kind of thing. And so that's the imagery there. Then in verse 19 it says, Gad attackers will attack him, but he will attack their heels. So we saw earlier in the map that Gad and Reuben are both on the east side of the Jordan. Reuben kind of disappears over time. Gad will have to fight, but as Jacob's prophecy says, they will fight back, and will do well. They will attack your heel. So their attackers will attack them, but he'll attack their heel. So as the attackers, they go away and they think they've won, they're going to be attacked. If you read the book of Joshua through, you're going to see a lot of these prophecies coming true. You don't have to wait till Babylon and Assyria and much later history. You can see it all in the time of the book of Judges. It says that he prophesies that Asher, his riches is food. He'll provide delicacies for a king. Apparently, was true about their land. They were the source of a lot of like the best foods for the kings that would come as monarchy started. What's also cool is that someone from the tribe of Asher in Luke chapter 2 is someone who prays over Jesus as he's born in the temple there. And so that was a cool parallel, I thought, because Asher providing food for kings, they kind of got to play a role there. Because Luke tells us they're the tribe of Asher. I think it was Anna, the prophetess. She was from the tribe of Asher, and so she got to like praise the Messiah as a young baby and everything. So I thought that was just kind of cool mentioned there. It says Naphtali is a doe let loose who offers words of beauty. What that means is, I definitely had to look that up because it's like confused. My daughter was sitting with me the other day and we're studying it. It's like, what does that mean? Why? So a female deer represents freedom, swiftness, grace, and beauty, and productivity, and eloquence of words. So that's Naphtali. They're just graceful, beautiful, freedom. They're free. They're swift. You think of a female deer as it goes around. They're just free to go, and they're productive and just eloquent with words. And so that's really kind of cool that their tribe. It says they settled in really fertile regions with natural beauty, and that their warriors had speed and effectiveness. And again, you read some of those details in the book of Judges. And then we close out with the fruitful son is Joseph, a fruitful son beside a spring. Daughters walk along the wall. So he's just saying like he's gonna have a lot of kids and it's gonna grow. He's gonna have a lot of land as well. Jacob recounts his history and also points to some common stuff that was going to happen in the future. It says the archers were bitter and shot arrows and hostile towards him. Think of his brothers and how bitter and jealous they were of him and how they went after him. Yet his bow was always filled, his arms quick moving by the hands of the mighty one of Jacob. So, he was always protected and kept safe by God. And certainly we see that with Joseph, and he testifies to that over and over again. But also it says, from there a shepherd, the stone of Israel, is going to come out of this tribe. And you think about what we've talked about before with Joseph, the Messiah, son of Joseph, and pointing to Jesus being the good shepherd. He's the stone, he's the capstone. Those references is what I think Jacob is referring to, the idea that the Messiah is going to come through this tribe as well. And it's going to be a Messiah who's attacked by those who are bitter and shoot their arrows, just like Joseph, but it's going to be God who protects them, right? Then that's the parallels with Joseph and Jesus, just that the Messiah, son of Joseph concept. And it says, from the God of your father who helps you, and Shaddai who blesses you, blessings of deep that lies below, blessings of breast and womb. So he's saying, let the, blessings of God be shown in what happens to you, despite all this other stuff. Let the earth grow and just be in bounty and blessings of breast and womb, just like you're going to have plenty of children. And so with Joseph, that's there, and with Jesus as well, the whole idea that he, is, Joseph and the tribes of Israel, they become, the northern tribes all become associated with them, with Joseph, with Ephraim, Manasseh. And it's always referring to them in terms of prophecies and their history. And they become the main, and Joseph himself, his name is also brought up. And it's not always in good context, like you've sinned, Joseph, you've sinned, Ephraim, you've sinned, Manasseh, but just in reference to those northern tribes, because Judah is always the reference to the southern kingdom, and it's Israel and Joseph and Ephraim, Manasseh. They're names used to refer to the northern kingdom and the other 10 tribes. And so that's what's being said here. Everyone's going to associate Joseph with that tribe and all the bounty of that, but then also looking at Jesus as the Messiah and how he's going to be blessed. I saw it as not just, his sons, like the tribe of Israel, but also sons from all the nations. So all of these blessings, what Jacob is saying, is going to be greater than the blessings I've received. That's what Joseph's going to have. And I think that blessing also points to the kind of blessing that Yeshua got to enjoy as the Messiah, son of Joseph, where even someone like me can be a son of his. So that's just really kind of cool to put that all together. And then finally we have Benjamin, the ravening wolf. The wolf obviously is a dangerous animal. It fights well and conquers. In the morning it devours spoils, in the evening divides plunder. Really interesting prophecy given to Benjamin. If you know your Bible history, if you don't, whatever, just keep this in mind. Saul comes from the tribe of Benjamin. There's a really terrible story of the tribe of Benjamin in the book of Judges where they kill a woman, and then I'm just trying to remember if she was a prostitute or not, but I know they killed a woman, and then they cut up. To not be blamed for it, this guy, I think it was a concubine of a Levite or something, and he cut her up into 12 pieces or a bunch of pieces and send her out to the other tribes to be like, oh, this is what tribe of Benjamin was done, and they would have a civil war with the rest of the tribe because why did you do this? What did you rape this woman and kill her and then lead to this whole thing? And so Benjamin as a tribe, you read through their history, and then you look at Saul and he became king. He wasn't supposed to. We saw Judah is the tribe the monarchy comes from, and that's where David is the one who's chosen from that tribe to be that first king from the tribe of Judah. But just the fighting and the hunger and the desire for plunder and wealth and everything else was definitely something associated with Benjamin there. Okay, so we look at all that. Jacob blesses them. Again, he says, don't bury me here, bury me at home. In chapter 50, Joseph falls on his father's face as he dies. He weeps over him. It's kind of a thing with Joseph, him falling over Benjamin and grabbing him and weeping. And so so he's weeping, he's mourning. It says they took him 40 days, they embalm him. And Egypt wept for 70 days. So those are mourning periods, preparation periods. Uh, and it's kind of like now we have like a flags of half staff for a president who just died. There's just like cultures, nations have these kind of rituals. So if you're just wondering about those things, that's what that's about. Robert Alter does mention that 72 is actually the Egyptian mourning, but the Bible writers would round that to 70 to fit their narrative more, and then the 40 is also significant for the Hebrews as well. We're going to see like Moses fasting for 40 days and 40 nights, and then Jesus doing that as well. So, and then 40 years in the desert. So the number 40 is also significant in that sense. So after they have their mourning period, he asked Pharaoh to let him go and bury his father as he promised. And so they do that. They almost everybody goes except the children. Once they cross into Canaan, into the other side of Jordan, he observed 7 days of mourning for his father. So now that they've entered into Canaan, you see them perform their own mourning rituals. So they were in Egypt and they performed mourning rituals. And now they're back in Canaan, they perform, and that's 7 days of mourning. And that's the first time I'm seeing a number assigned to this mourning period. We saw before how much Jacob grieved when he thought Joseph died. We saw mourning periods for Sarah, and Abraham went up to mourn for her, but I didn't remember a number of days given. I looked again. I might have missed it. So if I did, let me know. But I think this is the first time I'm seeing that, and I definitely know that today, like Jewish people will mourn for 7 days. They call it sitting Shiva, and this is just the tradition there. At least goes back this time in terms of how many days they mourn for 7 days. The Canaanites see it; they're like, "Wow, this is for the Egyptians is happening," and so they name it an Egyptian name. The writer's explaining that for anybody in the present day who's like, "Why is this place named after an Egyptian name?" It's because of how the Canaanites thought this was an Egyptian mourning thing. They didn't realize these were the Hebrews that they didn't really care for, the sons of Abraham, Israel, and Jacob. So they fulfilled Jacob's wishes as he commanded. They buried him, and then they went back home. Joseph then goes to talk to his brothers. His brothers are worried because they think dad's dead. Joseph's going to punish us. And then they say, "Hey, forgive us. Please don't do anything to us. It's bad," or whatever. And in saying that, it says Joseph wept. So he's hearing his brothers, and he's just like, "Come on!" Like you can see in his response, he's like, "No." Like in verse 19, it says they fall before him. Like, "We'll be your slaves. Like, please don't kill us. Don't hurt us." And he says, "Listen, don't be afraid. Like, am I in the place of God?" And he reiterates again how he was able to forgive. Talked about that last week. He was able to forgive because he kept in his perspective, like, God made this happen so that I would be in this position to save my family. And then remember, he put together a test to make sure that his brothers were safe. And once he saw they were safe, he opened up and forgave them and brought them in. And forgiveness means letting go of all debt, and it means letting it go. It doesn't mean holding any kind of grudge at any moment, thinking, "You know what, I do want some payback. I do want some payment for what happened." No, it's completely letting it go and letting it go forever. That's how forgiveness works. Otherwise, it's not forgiveness. And so he's explaining that to his brothers again, and they listen, and they're just kind of again finally just all together, and they grow up. He says he saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons grow up, and also the sons of Manasseh's son were born upon his knees. It's just this ritual about that. And then he tells his brother, "I'm about to die. God will take notice of you and bring you up from this land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." And he made them swear to him. He doesn't say to put the hand on the left thigh, but you have to assume that was the way that they would do an oath. "God takes notice of you, like, take my bones also." So Joseph knows that God at some point will single them out, which is interesting language because the way they leave Egypt is indeed singled out. It's not like a mixed group of people. It's the children of Israel that are taken out. He's going to single them out and take them out. And when that happens, he wants them to make sure that they take his bones with him. So they embalm him. He dies at 110 years old. Interesting, the number is short to 120. And he was placed in a coffin there. And so the idea is that later on he's going to be carried out, which does happen. Now, we look at our Haftarah. We look at our portion which comes from the prophets. And And I see that, so we're at 50 minutes. Okay, good. So I'm just going to wrap up now here with looking at this and looking at Peter. So we've looked at David's end of life before with Abraham, but in that reading we focused on the first chapter of First Kings, and that's where Nathan and Bathsheba conspired together to convince David that he had promised to give the throne to Solomon, which he didn't, but they were tricking him into it because he's old and he's not sure of what he did, and so that this is whole thing there. If you want to read it, it's in First Kings chapter 1. They're doing that because David's other son Adoniah is setting up himself to be the king, and so they trick David into that, and so David goes ahead and performs a ceremony, and he names Solomon his heir, and so he compared that to Abraham and the end of his life, and David has people lying to him, tricking him. He's not sure of exactly what happened in the past, and he's doing things based on what others are telling him to do. But Abraham was the opposite. He was very sure at the end of his life, and he had his two sons come together. David has his two sons fighting for the throne against each other. Just the differences between the two were apparent. And that is why this passage is given to us this week. In 1 Kings chapter 2, it says David charges his son Solomon. So what did Jacob do? Jacob tells his son Joseph, make sure you don't leave me here, bury me at home. And Joseph does that because Jacob's final concern is about the land, about being in Canaan, and we already discussed all that. He wants to be there, or he wants to be buried there. It's so important to him. He wants to be buried there. He doesn't want to be kept in Egypt any longer. With Joseph, same concern. I want to go back to the land that was promised to us. Make sure you don't leave me here. Right? That's the final charging. And you have the blessings in between and everything else. David, he's charging his son. And so what's really interesting, and again, this is just a viewpoint about, it may count as textual criticism, and so some people may disagree with it or be angry with it or whatever. It's clear. Okay, first of all, I'll just say this: who wrote the book of First Kings? It wasn't David. It wasn't anybody at that time. It wasn't Solomon. I mean, this fact is well known that the book of First Kings was written sometime after the exiles. Don't know how far after the Babylonian exile, which would have been 500 and something BC, or CE, or BCE or whatever. So it's like 1,000 years after these stories are taking place. But we know for sure it was written after that. We don't know how far after that. If when they came back or while they were in exile. Like the point is that First Kings, or the Book of Kings, it was just one book. It was divided later because the scrolls were too big, so they split it in two. The Book of Kings was written by priests, by priests, like a number of priests, or a single priest who's known as the Deuteronomist. It was written by them. What they did was they took the histories that they had written and compiled together. They wanted to make one copy of the history, and they wanted to, throughout the writing, interject the language from Deuteronomy to help the reader understand why things went wrong. That's the whole point of the Book of Kings. Again, it's written so that as you read it, and you're coming back from exile, or exile's already happened, you're wondering, man, why God's making all these promises to David and Solomon, and everything's here, but why are we now in exile? And so they wrote everything through the framework and the references of the book of Deuteronomy, which again wasn't really discovered for a long time until the reign of Josiah, which is like later in I think it's 2 Kings chapter 22, maybe 1 Kings 22, but it's either 1 or 2 Kings chapter 22, where they finally find the book of Deuteronomy, and that's where the kingdom starts to change, and they try to anyway, but it's too little too late in that sense. The reason why I say all that, right? You're wondering why you're saying all that, because it's evident that verses 3 through 4 were added in by the Deuteronomists. As an editorial note, as a way for the reader to think that David was a little more noble at the end of his life than what we would read without that. Because in those passage, and this is where, looking at the text, and it's being okay understanding where this comes from, because the Spirit of God still compiled these things in a way, and we can understand what He's trying to teach us through it. Again, the point of Kings, as we study Kings, is not history, it's history with perspective. It's after the fact. They're rewriting the history and adding in the perspective of why we failed, so that you can read that, and we failed from the Deuteronomy. And the law of Deuteronomy says, keep charge of Adonai your God, to walk in His ways, to keep His statutes, His commandments, His ordinances, His decrees, was written in the Torah of Moses. All of that language comes from the book of Deuteronomy, but in writings that are dated before the exiles and before all this, like even like the book of Samuel, this kind of language is missing outside of like Joshua, because that's not something that was, or even those books were compiled and edited later, so you're going to see verses like that there as well. But the historical, like the older copies, don't have this type of language in it. This type of language pops up after the exiles, and with the priesthood that was formulating, trying to repurpose the books that they had, rewriting scrolls because you want them to be destroyed. It's just paper, and then saying, okay, we're going to add in some perspective. It's just to say that's very likely, and the reason why, again, because if we take that out, David's end of life charge to Solomon is very dark. It doesn't have a lot of hope in it. It's the words of a very vengeful man. So for just the purposes of what we're doing here, right? If let's pretend, because we're looking at this whole teaching together and why they're being taught together. Let's say that the chapter 3 and 4 don't exist. So he charges his son Solomon, and he says, you also know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me. So it starts off the gate with David saying, you know what Joab has done to me, and he's saying, I want revenge for what Joab did. There are people that did things to David in his lifetime that he didn't react to, including his son Absalom. His son who raped his daughter Tamar, Amnon. He just didn't react to these things that were done to him. Or in his family, he didn't try to correct things. He just kind of let them happen. And now he's asking Solomon to finish his business. So he tells Solomon, you know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, has done to me. He did what he did to 2 commanders of the armies of Israel, to Abner, son of Ner, Massa, son of Jether, whom he killed, shedding the blood of war in peacetime, putting the blood of war on his waistband. So there was war going on with Absalom, and everything else is happening with David's lifetime. And at some point, David had some kind of peace created, and then Joab went ahead and killed this guy because he was getting revenge for his own brother that was killed. And then also he kills Absalom when he told everybody, don't touch my son, and Absalom's hanging there by his hair, and then Joab kills him. So he has, vengeance in his mind. And so in verse 6 he says, so act according to your wisdom, and let his gray hair not go down to Sheol in shalom, in peace. So kill him and don't let him be at peace with it. And Joab's story is crazy. He knows Solomon's going to kill him. He runs to the temple, or to the tabernacle. He grabs hold of the altar, the horns on the altar, and he's like, don't kill me. I'm just gonna stay here, and don't kill me. I don't, you shouldn't kill me. I'm holding the altar we put that we sacrifice on. I'm gonna hold this. And then Solomon just sends his guy in there, go kill him anyway, and he goes and kills him while he's holding onto the horns of the altar. So he literally does not let him die in any kind of peace, and so he goes to the grave that way. He tells him to show kindness to sons of Barzillai. That was just, okay, repay the kindness for these people who took care of me. Repay them. That's cool. I want you to do that. And then with Shimei, son of Gera, the Benjamite, he says he cursed him with a grievous curse. So when he was running away from Absalom, this guy saw David and started cursing him and cursing him and cursing him, and just was so mad at him, was cursing at him and throwing insults at him. And then once David got back to his kingship, the guy was definitely scared, and David is like, don't worry, I'm not going to do anything to you, because he swore that he wouldn't. I will not put you to death with sword. But in verse 9, he says, now don't let him go unpunished. Now that I'm dying, I want you to kill him and figure out a way to do it, because I promised I wouldn't. And so he says, for you're a wise man, you'll know how to deal with him and bring his hair down to Sheol with blood. And what Solomon does later on is just after this, he creates like this situation where he's like, if you stay in this territory, you can live. And the guy's like, okay. And then I forget exactly what happens. Something happens where the guy leaves. There's like a crime that's committed, a theft or something. And so he chases somebody and he ends up leaving his territory. It happens 3 years after the fact. And so Solomon hears about it. He's like, oh, good. Now I can go kill that guy for my dad. And so it says David slept with his fathers, was buried in the city of David, and David reigned over Israel the years. And this is how David's life ends. Without verses 3 and 4, to kind of add in some kind of favor towards David in the end of his life and say that he had these noble words from Solomon about keeping the way of God. Without that, it's a very stark contrast, right? For Jacob and for Joseph, the looking ahead is all about being in the promised land, and that's all that matters. I want to be in the promised land. I want to be buried there. I know God's going to fulfill the covenant of the promise that he gave to my father and your fathers, that we're going to have this land. This land will always be ours. And so Jacob and Joseph, in terms of charging the future, say, make sure we're brought out of Egypt and buried in the promised land so we can take part of that inheritance and that promise from God. That was where their future and their hope was laid on, in the obtaining of that promised land. For David, his final charges to his son have everything to do with him settling scores. And it has to make you wonder where his heart was at. And I've mentioned this before, and everybody likes to quote the passages about David being a man after God's own heart, and certainly he was an impressive figure in all that time. But from the moment he stood on the top of his palace and saw everything he had, and he had all that power, and he decided to take that woman who was bathing in secret and to bring her into his bed, against her will or not, probably against her will, most likely against her will. Power works that way. From that moment, his whole thing changed. The heart after God and everything else it didn't jive. There were always problems, and God was instead telling him how things are going to go wrong for him as time goes on, and how eventually, the prophecy comes to Solomon, hey, for your sake, for your dad's sake, I'm not going to let you experience a kingdom being broken, but it's going to be broken afterwards. And so it just seems to me like David's focused on the wrong things at the end of his life. He's focusing on vengeance and getting vengeance even after he's dead. And so with that, we close with our passage from 1 Peter. And so in 1 Peter chapter 1, his audience, they're sojourners, right? He calls them sojourners. To the sojourners of the diaspora, sojourners are travelers or people who don't have a home. He's speaking to the fact that Jerusalem has, been ransacked and destroyed and the temple's been destroyed by the Romans, or it's in that process, and so everybody's scattered out of Jerusalem. So they're the diaspora. They've left. They're dispersed out into all those surrounding areas. And so just like Joseph, who is a sojourner, and Jacob, who is a sojourner, he is speaking to them, and he's saying, you've been chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, just like Joseph was chosen, right? We've talked about that. Just like David was chosen. David was chosen to be the king by God. It's certainly what Samuel was communicating in choosing him. Sojourners who are chosen. That's in Peter's day. He's talking to the Jewish faith, the believers who have come to believe in Yeshua as the Messiah, and now they've been dispersed out of Jerusalem because of the threat of Roman occupation. They're going to destroy the temple. And so now me as a believer, so many years later, I'm certainly not under that threat, but I still need to consider myself a sojourner, in that I am not in the land that I am being promised to be my final home. I'm not. And for me, that land isn't necessarily Israel either. It's not the promised land. For me, it's a hope that's reserved in a different place. And that's what this whole passage is about. For Peter. He's saying, we've been chosen. For those of you who are dispersed now, you're sojourning, certainly can apply to you and me. We're traveling this world. We don't have a home in this world that we would call our own. And we've been set apart by the Spirit for obedience and sprinkled with the blood of Yeshua. That means we've been sanctified, set apart for a purpose. And he says in verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Yeshua the Messiah. In his great mercy, he caused us to be born again to a living hope. And what Jacob had was was it a living hope? I don't know. He certainly thought it would be eventually given to his descendants, and he wanted to be there. And it's kind of funny that he's like, take my bones there. Did they believe in a resurrection is kind of what I'm asking. And I don't know, but I don't know if Jacob and Joseph thought, they put my bones there so that when the end comes and we rise again, like we'll be here in this land. I don't know if that's like the full extent of what they believed in. I think it was simpler than that. I think it was just like, we want to be buried here because we know this land is going to be given to us by God, and this is the land he's promised us, and that's where our ancestors will be, and that's where we want to be as well. Just full stop, like that's the end. Peter is saying, we have a different hope. We have a living hope through the resurrection of the Yeshua. It's a hope that's incorruptible, undefiled, unfading, and it's reserved in heaven for us. And so it's not reserved in a certain land like in Israel for us. It's reserved in heaven. It's kept in a place with God himself. And by trusting, you're being protected by God's power for salvation, ready to be revealed in that last time. And so that's another hope we have towards the end. At the end, I should say, at the last time of judgment, we're going to have this revelation given to us and the rest of the world to what the hope is, and that hope is real, that this hope we have is in Jesus, and it's reserved there, and it's real, and it won't be destroyed. And this hope is one of dwelling with him, right? And we're filled with the joy, with the glorious words, outcome of your faith, salvation of your souls. And that's like the revelation of the Messiah. That's what I was looking for. So we are, that is our final hope, our final, moment of glory is his final revelation, who he is. And that's where our faith is in, right? We believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that he is the Messiah, the son of Joseph, that he suffered and that he died for the sins of the people, for my sins and for your sins. And then he rose again, and hidden in his resurrection, we have the hope that he will then return again as the Messiah, son of David. And in that returning is where our final hope is revealed, as we are kind of, revealed with him to be the sons of God in that whole process of redemption and final kingdom and final days and so on and so forth. And so, as I read through this passage, as we're getting ready to close, I think it's great to have hope or legacy in this world. I think it's really important. I think for Jacob, for Joseph, for Abraham, for David. David definitely was thinking about his legacy, but he was thinking about his legacy in the sense of, wow, people are going to think, this guy got away with it, this guy got away with that. They never got punished for what they did to King David. Joab and Shimei, it's like they're going to get away with that. And definitely David's thinking about his legacy, and he's thinking of it in terms of power and the way human beings think of power. And yet we have Jacob and Joseph and Peter here teaching us the same concept, that the way we need to think about legacy is not about our own power and how we lived up to some kind of standard of human power in this world, but about God's power and ability to do the things that he has promised to do, and to fulfill them, and to fulfill them well, and to fulfill them fully. So Jacob and Joseph knew God will fulfill his promise. He will give our ancestors the land, and so we want to be buried there so we can be a part of that. For us, we have a fuller picture than Jacob and Joseph might have had. We see the Messiah now, that he came, that he died, that he rose again. And so we have a promise about a future and a living hope, one that's reserved for us and is is kept for us and reserved for us and cannot be destroyed, and can't be defiled, and it's all kept in Jesus himself, and that it will be revealed, and that's what we hope. And notice what Peter throws in the middle of that. He says the trials that you have during this time, what are they for? They're so your faith, the true metal of your faith, is purified, right? So what is the metal your faith is made out of is the question. What is the metal of this object? If you ever have a metal that it's like unclear, like what is this thing made out of? Is it gold? Is it silver? Is it copper? Is it aluminum? Is it platinum? Like we don't know. We don't. It's kind of mixed together. It's ugly. It's just bronze. The best way to test out what the metal is to burn it, let it separate, let it cool, and then you see what the actual metal is that this object is made out of. What Peter is doing there is he's saying is your faith is made out of a metal. What kind of metal is it made out of, though? In order to purify it and to test it and purify it, there's got to be some fire applied to it, some heat. And so that's what the testing and the trials are about on this earth. And I read through all of 1 Peter and 2 Peter, and it's not just like any day kind of trials that he's talking about. Well, certainly those things can apply. He's mostly talking about the kinds of trials that are suffered because you are walking the way of Adonai, you're walking the way of God, the way of Jesus, the Messiah, you're walking his way, and in walking that way, you are met with disdain. You are met with suffering and anguish. And these types of trials, like Joseph, he was just walking the way of God. He received a dream. It was a prophecy about the future. He spoke the prophecy like he was supposed to. His brothers received it with jealousy and bitterness, and it led to his own suffering. And then he was just doing what was right. He was keeping charge of the house of Potiphar, and he didn't do anything wrong. He was running it as God would and administrating it, and that was being seen, and he was being blessed. But then this woman wants to sleep with him, and he doesn't want to do that. He's going to do what's right, and he ends up in a dungeon. There the whole thing. He's doing everything right all the time, and he's met with suffering and met with suffering and met with suffering. And what's it for? It's so that at the end, as he comes out of it all, his faith is proven to be pure. There's nothing in it that doesn't belong. And his hope is what? You're going to put my bones there in the promised land as well, just like Dad wanted, because that's where God has promised us to be, and he's going to fulfill it. Even if I've lived my whole life here in Egypt and have kids here and everything else, I know we're not going to stay here. He's promised us that land, and so that's where I'm going. And that's where their faith had to be. Where does our faith have to be? Our faith has to be in Jesus as the Son of God. He came to this world. He died on the cross for our sins. He rose again. He's coming back for us. That's where our faith has to be. Ultimately, like that's the metal. That's what it boils down to. And the trials that we have are to get there. That's where we get there. That's how we get there, to know that that's what's important. That's what we believe. And there are many of us. And again, it's the trials of life related to that belief. We have that belief, and so we're following the way of God. And the trials we have are related to our beliefs, and they're attacks against us or whatever problems related to the fact that we're staying on the path. And as we stay on the path, we have trials, and those trials are meant to say, okay, so are you going to walk away from the faith now? You went out and you talked about Jesus, or you talked about God, or you declared your faith out in public. Even me now, like it's obvious is what I believe, but even me now saying what I believe on video, putting it out there on YouTube, it's a way for others to see it. And, if they want to come at me, they can come at me or whatever. And that's a way of being tested or tried, so on and so forth, for my faith. And then what's my response to that? Right? How do I come out of that? That's where God sees the true metal of my faith. So that's where I'm going to end this week's teaching. Thank you again for watching, for studying along with me. I'll be posting the next teachings probably tomorrow or on Saturday. We are going to go into the book of Exodus. I know this is really fast-paced. Life comes at you really hard, but just if you can try to read these passages a couple times throughout the week, and that way, if you get a chance to watch the podcast and to study along, it's not all foreign to you, and then we could just hopefully grow together. Thank you again for watching. I pray for all of you who do watch, I pray this mainly that through this teaching, all of us become more secure and grounded in the faith that we have, and that our faith grows smaller so that it's more accurate, smaller to the size of a mustard seed, so that even at that size, it's powerful enough to move mountains. And so, we need, in other words, it needs to be refined. It needs to be brought down. It needs to be brought down to the core parts, so we can focus on what's really important, and from there, power is gained. And so that's my prayer for you and for myself as well. It's been my prayer for a while. Pray with me with that, and hopefully we can see this amazing growth in our relationship and walk on this earth. So thank you again for watching. God bless.